let's go ahead and get started. Again, I'm Claire Mambiella. I'm the library law consultant and current technical inept person because today has been just one of those days. But I think we have it all figured out. So let's talk about establishment. Okay. And there we go. Okay, so the first thing is our disclaimer, and that's just something I always have to put up just to remind people that I'm not their attorney and I cannot act as such, and the information I'm providing is strictly for information and for your own edification, but if you need legal advice, you would need to contact your attorney. So let's talk about establishment. In Michigan, we currently have 10 different establishment types. We have a city home rule library under the Home Rule City Act. So that would be a city library that was established with charter section, and only a home ruled city can establish that. We have a city section 1 of the City, Village, and Township Libraries Act, which is the infamous PA 164, and City Section 1 is allows a city to establish a library via a resolution or an ordinance, and provides for a elected board, or I'm sorry, an appointed board, and it's a governing board with full board powers. Then we have a City Section 10A, City Library. So this is 3 different city libraries. A City Section 10A is a city library established by a vote, by like a ballot question that established a millage, and also has a 6-member elected board. So a charter, then we have 3 township libraries. So 3 city libraries, 3 township libraries. One's Charter Township Library under the Charter Township Act, allows a charter township to create a library with a resolution. And then the Charter Township Board is the board of the library. Then we have a township library under PA 269, which is a repealed act, and there's only a few left in the state. And that is kind of a legally problematic establishment type right now. But that originally functioned under the school code. So it was a library established by a township under the school code, and it was similar to a charter township library where the township actually ran the library. And then you have a township library under PA 164, which is a library established via a ballot question and a vote with a millage and elected board. And then we have a village library under Section 10 of PA 164, similarly to a township library. It is a result of a vote of a ballot question, and also has an elected board and a millage. So here's the rest of them. We have a county library. County libraries are established by the county and with a county library board. And then we have a district library under the District Library Establishment Act from 1989. And that is, district libraries can be formed a couple different ways. They can be formed by libraries, existing libraries, either joining together, or a existing library joining with municipality, or it can be municipalities without libraries joining together to create a district library. And usually it can occur with a petition and a vote. Or it can occur just with an agreement between those entities, and then often there is also a vote for a millage. District libraries can have appointed or elected boards. And then we have co-ops, and a co-op is also a library, so it is a library establishment type. A co-op library is established under the State Aid to Libraries Act, and there are about 11 of them throughout the state. And they function as, even though they're called libraries, they function as kind of service entities. So why does this matter? Why are we having this webinar today? Why are we talking about establishment? Well, the reason why it matters is a library's establishment statute forms the basis for that library's existence in the law. So your establishment statute is the entity that permits your library to function, that permits your library an identity to the law, makes it a thing within the law. So just like, the constitutions, the Michigan Constitution, US Constitution, establish an individual's rights within the law, and then you also have various state statutes and federal statutes. As far as a library goes, it also has to have some kind of legal support for existing. So it has to have some kind of authority to have an identity, to be able to have a bank account, to be able to spend money, to be able to collect tax dollars, to be able to hire people and pay payroll taxes for those people and be an employer. So all of those things come from the legal statute, a legal permission, a legal identity. Just like with a corporation, any company has to have some kind of legal identity. So that usually comes through the corporation laws, how those companies are formed, whether it's a private company or whether it's a public company, that or a nonprofit corporation. It's legal identity and its ability to function within the way of doing business or providing services occurs because of that legal statute, that legal authority. So for libraries, that legal authority is your establishment statute, and that establishment statute provides all of the authority for your library, as I said, to function. And it also provides the detail as to how your library functions, on what level your library functions, because there are different levels of functionality. So without an establishment statute, then your library really has no official existence. It's kind of like a person without a birth certificate or without any kind of legal documentation. It's hard to figure out exactly who they are and where they belong and what their rights and privileges are. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what these establishment laws look like. So within these establishment laws, so now that you know what these establishment laws do, within these establishment laws, in other words, what these look like and how your rights, how can you tell when you read your establishment law what your rights are? The first thing that occurs is usually it gives an authority for creation of the library. The establishment laws will say who or what can create a library. Can your municipality create the library? Can individual electors get together and via a petition create a library? Can a library create another library? How do libraries get formed? And then usually the establishment law will also lay out at least some semblance of the process for how that occurs. Now, there may be additional standards or rules attached to a statute that kind of give more details on the process, but the statute itself will lay out at least the initial process on how that formation must occur or what documents must be submitted for that formation. And for example, whether it needs to be a resolution or an ordinance, or whether you need to have a vote to establish a library. It may not tell you exactly what that resolution will look like, but it will tell you have to have a resolution. And then it tells you governance. How is this library governed? What body or what entity is in charge of the structure within the library? So for in most instances, it'll lay out whether the municipality runs the library, whether there is a board that runs the library, whether there is an advisory board versus a governing board. Most of the time there is a governing board, and the governing board, the statute will lay out details of the governing board. Is the governing board elected versus appointed? How many people sit on the governing board? How many trustees are there? Who decides whether it's appointed or elected? Is it dictated by the statute, or does the entity creating it have a choice? What is a qualification to be a board member? In most instances, the statutes will say that a board member must be a qualified elector, which means they must be able to vote. Now notice that it doesn't say resident, it says elector. Most of the time, if you're an elector, you are a resident as well. And then very often they'll also tell you if a board member can be removed and what that form of removal is. Can a appointed board member be removed by their municipality? Is an appointed or an elected board member only removable by the governor? Very often your establishment law will tell you that. So here we have laws tell you the creation, the authority, and the method of creation of the library, and then as well the governance of the library. And then they will also lay out the powers of this entity. So what are the fiscal powers? What authority does the library have over its own money? And who wields that authority? Is it the board that wields the authority? Is it the municipality that wields the authority? For most library establishment types in Michigan, it's the board that wields that authority. And in each of these instances, the statute actually states that the board has exclusive control over the money as far as the spending goes. In many establishment types, the actual holding of the money is vested within the municipality, but the expenditures are vested in the board. So it's kind of like a checks and balance. One entity actually holds the cash and accounts for the cash. The other entity has the ability to determine how that cash is spent. Can they own property? Can they build buildings? Can they levy bonds? Can they levy millages? Those kinds of rights and privileges are also listed in the statute. For most library establishment types, you find that while they are permitted to have millages and bonds, they cannot levy them themselves. The library has to work through its municipality in order to get a millage or to levy a bond. However, a district library is bestowed with the authority to actually introduce and levy its own bonds and its own millages. So it has an even higher level of authority and control than most municipal libraries do. It's kind of a higher level entity. And then it will also indicate whether or not the board is empowered with hiring personnel. And in most cases, the board is empowered with hiring a director and in some instances their assistants. So let's look at each individual establishment. So in terms of family characteristics, when we talk about family characteristics, there are certain elements of different types of establishment that you can almost, that you want to look at. When you're looking at your establishment law, one of the things you want to consider, especially if you're not sure what your establishment type is, there are some certain hallmarks that can help you figure out what your establishment type is because they differ from type to type. So one of those is the number of board members. So the number of board members can be very distinctive from establishment type to establishment type. So that's one characteristic that can help you determine, is my library, say, a PA 164 versus a home like a PA 164 section 10 city versus, 10A city versus a PA 164 section 1 city, because a section 1 city has a 5-member appointed board between 5 and 9 member odd number appointed board. But a city section 10A will always have a 6-member elected board. So if you're a city library and you're not sure if you're a PA 164 section 1 or a PA 164 section 10A, you can look at the number of board members you have and whether they're elected or appointed. And that can give you a very good indication of which type you are. Another thing that can give you a good indication is your funding. If you have a millage, an elected millage, then chances are you're probably either a district library or a PA 164. If your library has an appropriation, then it's a good bet that you could be either a city home rule library or a city section 1 library under PA 164, because those are the two types of city libraries where you would get a city appropriation as opposed to a millage. You could also be a charter township, which would be a library that would have an appropriation. There are some rare instances of district libraries that are funded through appropriations. A district library simply states that the district library agreement must indicate how the library is to be funded. Most district libraries are funded with millages, but it is possible for a district library to be funded in other ways, but it's not common. If you look at your documents, what kind of documents you have, if you have something called a district library agreement, then obviously you're likely a district library. If you have something called an organizational plan, an organizational plan is a yellow piece of paper, at least the originals were yellow. And what it was a form from the Library of Michigan. When the District Library Establishment Act came out in 1989, any district library that was formed under the previous act, so any district libraries that had already existed in 1989 were kind of grandfathered in to the District Library Establishment Act. And one of the ways that that was done was through the use of organizational plans. So the law in '89 said that in order for a library that had been established under the earlier act to be recognized under the 1989 act, that earlier district library had to complete this organizational plan. Now, the organizational plan was supposed to kind of incorporate or mimic the information that is supposed to be included in a district library agreement, which was required under the '89 Act. So the idea was that by completing these organizational plans, these libraries, these district libraries that had existed prior to the '89 Act would be brought into compliance by these organizational plans, and they would then kind of have a district library agreement, because many of them did not have a district library agreement under the earlier act. So the idea was to kind of give them a district library agreement through the use of these organizational plans. The problem is the organizational plans are really not that, they do not have very much information in them, and they do not do a really great job of mimicking a district library agreement. But they do have some information. So if you have an organizational plan, then you know that you were probably a district library that was or originally organized prior to the '89 Act. Resolutions. If you have resolutions that discuss the forming of your library, then, again, depending on whether you're talking about a city resolution or a township resolution, then again, you could be a PA 164 Section 1. You could be, depending on what the resolution says, it's possible you're a PA 164 township library, or you may be a charter township library. So a lot of it just depends on what that exact resolution states. If you have ballot or millage language, most PA 164 libraries are established just through the ballot language. So if all you have is ballot language and you have an elected board, then chances are you're a PA 164 library. If you have ordinances that govern your library that were created specifically for a public library, then you likely are a city Section 1 library or a home rule city library. Or you may also have letters in your files. Say there could be a letter from the Library of Michigan that confirms your establishment type. Usually when a library is first established, the Library of Michigan issued letters, congratulating the library and confirming with the library that the Library of Michigan recognizes this library as a blank library. So it would list your establishment type. Some very older libraries may not have those letters, and I'm talking about libraries like from the 1800s, early 1900s, but many, many libraries do. So let's talk about groupings of establishment. So what we could call clans of libraries. The majority of library establishment types are tucked under Chapter 397 of the statutes of the Michigan compiled laws. So this is where you'll find the District Library Establishment Act. This is where you'll find the County Library Act. This is where you'll find PA 164, the City, Township, Village Library Act. And these are all acts that were specifically created by the legislature for the creation of public libraries. They tend to be, any of these acts under the libraries chapter tend to be very well defined. So the laws tend to be very well defined as far as what the authorities are, what the board structure is, how they get funded. They're not perfect. Many of these statutes can be kind of confusing, and they're not, well tested in the law, and there still are a lot of questions with many of them. But for all intents and purposes, they do provide quite a bit of information on the authority of a library and how it is supposed to run. Now, then we have some of these other libraries that for various reasons were created either before the establishment of these libraries in the library chapter or after, or for specific reasons. And these kind of outlier library establishment types tend to be less well defined. And this would be things like the Charter Township Library Establishment Act, which is what is up on the screen. This particular, not charter, the home rule city. The authority to establish a library for a home rule city is vested in its Home Rule City Act, but within a provision that permits the city to own or condemn property. And the provision actually states that it can maintain, develop, operate property, for the purposes, for public purposes, such as things like City Hall, police, gardens, museums, and libraries. So it just mentions essentially that a city may purchase a building to operate as a library. And courts interpreted this provision to mean that the legislature was permitting home rule cities to actually establish and operate libraries. But there's nothing in here that discusses the authority of that library, the structure of that library, the governance of that library. So it's pretty well assumed and established that if in this particular establishment type, when the city creates it, it becomes a city department instead of a more autonomous entity like most of the other library establishment types. Then you have some other libraries like the Charter Township Library. So a Charter Township Library is a little better defined than a city home rule library, but not as well defined as, say, a township library under PA 164, or a district library, or a county library. So a Charter Township Library allows a charter township to establish a library with a resolution. It requires that the resolution gets sent to the Library of Michigan. It requires a 7-member advisory board. So it doesn't have a governing board. It has an advisory board that is removable at will by the county, by the township. It does not have a lot of information as to, how the money is handled, how the actual library is operated. It does talk about the ability to appoint a library director. It does vest the township with the ability to set rules and regs. It does require that the township establish rules and regulation for the operation of a library. So it does provide some more clarity and more authority and more direction for the operation of a library than the Home Rule City Act does. But it's not quite as fleshed out as those library types under the Chapter 397. Now, if you do have a question as to the authority of your library or the authority of your board to do something, reading your Establishment Act can give you some insight as to how much autonomy your board has versus how much control your municipality has over your library. So in a PA 164 Section 1 library, so this is the city library that was formed by ordinance and has an appointed board between 5 and 9 members. Because this establishment type can be established by ordinances, and the city can pass ordinances that help regulate the library, and because it's an appointed board, and because the city can determine the number of board members, this establishment type is pretty tied to its municipality. The municipality also has the choices for funding. So the municipality has the option to levy a millage without a vote in a PA Section 1 library, or it can put a vote on the ballot for a millage. So it has some options, and that options are determined largely by the city, not by the board of the library. Although the board does have complete control over the expenditures of the money, and there have been legal authority that upholds the board's autonomy with regard to the finances. So city Section 1 libraries are largely considered to be somewhat autonomous, but they still do have ties to the city, but they're not like a city department. Then you have a PA 164 City 10A library, which is even further autonomous from its city. Because it has an elected millage, an elected board, there's very little options for city determination. So in other words, the city has very little input into how this library runs. It does not appoint members. It cannot determine what type of millage. The board of the library does have to work with its city under this library type in order to get a millage on the ballot. But the city really has very limited authority to control what the library wants to do. And then you have a home rule city library, which is pretty much has very little autonomy from its city because it is pretty much a department of the city. Now, how can you figure out if you don't have a good indication as to your establishment type, or maybe you have some clues but you really want to confirm it? Well, there's a couple things you can do. I know many libraries on their website have an explanation of their history, and sometimes that history, even the dates, can be very helpful. If you know your library was established in 1938, for example, it can be very helpful to have that date as a starting place. What kind of documentation do you have? Do you have a file? Do you have newspaper articles that talk about the creation of your library? Do you have a letter from the Library of Michigan? Do you have a local history section in your library with books that depict the history of your municipality? All of these can be used to locate the establishment of your library. Many municipal histories talk about their libraries, and some of them even have pictures of libraries, when they first got started versus what they looked like when that book comes out. Newspapers are really good. If you run newspaper, it'll tell you, when millages were enacted. So if you know that your library has a millage, you can go back to when that millage was enacted, and you can look at the ballot language. Many counties have historical ballot language available electronically. If you need to go farther back, past what the city may have, you can online. A lot of older newspapers used to publish sample ballots or ballot language either before or after the fact. You can check us. We have files at Library of Michigan for every library that applies for state aid. So in those files, we collect as much documentation as we can for individual libraries. For some libraries, we have a lot of documentation. For other libraries, we don't have so much. But if you were to contact us and we didn't have what you wanted, you could just talk to me, and I'd be happy to try to track down your establishment I'm working on a few right now. There may be legal documentation. If you have legal counsel that your library's had for a long time, that legal counsel may have a file that contains some of your establishment information. Your municipal council may have a similar file. If your municipal council, your city attorney, your township attorney is the one that handles some legal issues for your library, they may have a file that has some information about your establishment type. So there are lots of different information that you can get. It takes a little bit of legwork, and like I said, I'd be happy to help you. But if you don't know your establishment, there are ways to try to get at it, in addition to kind of the deductive ways that we spoke about earlier in terms of analyzing what kind of board you have, what kind of millage you have, and your municipality. So putting all those pieces together and then using that information to acquire more information and looking at things like municipal history, like what you see on the screen here from Brown City. This was from a book that's published every so often, because Brown City holds, or used to hold, these homecomings every few years. And within these books, there's always a section on the library. And it goes through kind of a detailed history of the library and how it came about. So, you know, that was very helpful to try to figure out how that library was established. And many other municipalities have those too. So this is just some more discussion on how to get to that information. I go through a lot of newspaper collections, and all I do is I just put in the library's name and I just start looking. And I just keep working my way back until I get to a point where they talk about a library being established, or donations of books to, or maybe a new library building. And I just kind of, you know, read all of those pieces looking for clues as to millages, as to, you know, number of board members, as to any kind of thing I can get to try to piece together an establishment. In some instances, you could go through the minutes of your municipality. So your city or your township, you can go through the minutes of that council. And, you know, if you have an idea that it's 1938 is when your library was established because of some other information, or if you know your first millage cropped up in like 1964, if you have a current millage, you can keep walking that millage back. You know, you go back, you know, a few years, or if you have right now a 5-year millage or a 4-year millage, go back 4 years and see when that millage was up. And then you go to the prior one before that. And then you look at that information, you take that information to get to the prior one before that. And you can keep kind of leapfrogging backwards until you get to the earliest millage. And then you can look in the minutes of your municipality from that time period and look to see when they start discussing that a library was under, you know, being considered. If you have a new building, or you have a building totally dedicated to the library, you can look back at property records and see if it switched ownership at a certain time, or if it was given to the library, or when it was built. As I said before, we have a lot of historical documents here. We have library history documents. We have old library directories. We have old trustee directories. We have old Library of Michigan newsletters reaching all the way back to the 1920s. And in some cases, we have a few even before that, where you can look at, you know, was my library listed in this library directory from, you know, 1938? If it wasn't, well, when did it first get listed? So you can start with 1938 and keep going forward until you see the first time your library is listed. Many of the library directories or these library newsletters, you know, would have notes in it that welcome new libraries. So, you know, if you work through the directories and you see the first time your library is listed as 1950, then you can go to the newsletters in 1950 and see if it talks about when your library came into existence. And it will mention your establishment and mention your first director and all of that kind of stuff. So, like I said, it is a bit of legwork. It can be fascinating. It can be a lot of fun. It can also take a lot of time. But in the end, you have a kind of a nice documentation of where your library came from. And that can be really, really helpful, especially when you're trying to answer some hard questions about, you know, what authority does your municipality have over you? Or, you know, how did your board structure come about, especially if maybe your board structure has evolved over the years and is maybe a little strange. So then this is just some more examples. And then, you know, what if you don't find anything? Well, like I said, usually when you put all of the pieces you know together, there's enough to at least make a kind of a gut feeling decision. Like I said, having an elected board and an elected millage is a pretty good determination of being a PA 164. It's not always absolute, but it's a pretty, you know, chances are high enough that, you know, most of the time we feel comfortable moving forward in that way. There are some instances of, you know, maybe you have a millage, but maybe you have the wrong number of board members. We do have some of that. And again, when you look at all the pieces you do have, sometimes a determination might need to be made to amend your board numbers in order to conform with a particular library establishment type, which makes things a little bit, could make things a little bit easier for your library moving forward when you're trying to determine certain things. But that's, again, something to discuss with your attorney when you get to that point. Even if you're in the position where you just have done a lot of research and you're just having no luck and you have just some pieces that aren't quite adding up to a definitive answer, your legal counsel can really help you. Your library attorney could really help you. And in some instances, you could just simply reestablish, which would not, you know, often cause too much harm or too much trouble, again, depending on what your exact scenario is. It may mean lowering board members, it may mean raising board members, you know, it may mean going for a millage, but in most instances, I think usually from what I've seen so far, we've been able to, you know, kind of establish an establishment type without too much of a problem. You can always contact us, you can always contact me, and you can always contact your legal counsel if you have questions about your establishment. Now, if you decide you want to reestablish, that's definitely a possibility. If over the years your library's establishment type just is no longer working reliably for you, sometimes a municipality determines that for whatever reason it's no longer able to continue its library in its current type or its current way, and so a reestablishment is needed. And so depending on what your current establishment type is, it is definitely possible to reestablish. City Section 1 libraries can become City Section 10 libraries, City Section 10A libraries. Any library can become a district library if you find a partner and you work through the steps. So there are, you know, different options depending on what your circumstances are. Sometimes you have a law that changes, like happened with the 269 libraries, and a library has to reestablish. But like I said, there are options, and your legal counsel as well as LM, we can discuss all those options with you and work with you and your legal counsel to get your reestablishment together without too much harm or disarray to your operations. Okay, so the last thing I just want to say is it's very important that you get to know what your establishment is. It's also very important that you read your establishment law. I know it's really boring, but that's really important because, as I said, that really forms the basis for everything. It's difficult for a library to confidently move forward and to work within its municipality and to really take full advantage of all of its authority and everything that it has the possibility to do if the entities or the people that govern that facility don't really know what their establishment type is and haven't read the law. So I really encourage boards and I encourage directors to really read and understand your establishment law so that you understand what the possibilities are and what your authority is in terms of being able to govern your library and move it in the direction that you would like to see it go. Thank you very much. Again, I apologize for the technological issues. Sometime, I hope one of these months, I will have a webinar where I don't run into an establishment problem, where I don't run into a technological problem. We've been moving around rooms here in the Library of Michigan, so I've been kind of going to different rooms, and sometimes that means that the projection abilities are a little different, and sometimes that plays havoc with my individual laptop and its settings. So that's kind of what some of these problems have been. Thank you very much for attending the webinar. I really appreciate it. I will be sending out that survey, and I will send you out the slides. Thanks very much, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day.